So our objectives of the presentation, we can go back, yeah, is really to go over the importance of an evidence generation strategy and that it's effective, right? Really to talk about how to develop a good, effective evidence generation strategy that's integrated. We'll talk about a bunch of different places that evidence generation lives in life sciences companies, and then really talk about how to identify internal and external stakeholders for collaboration. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, right, evidence really does live in lots and lots of places throughout the throughout a life sciences organization. And go ahead, Meg, did you want to talk a little bit more about this?
I think that's pretty much, yeah. So evidence can, lives in across many teams. Many people are interested in generating evidence for just a lot of different reasons. As you can see, there's a lot of different stakeholders that are really important. They have different needs. For example, you need evidence for the FDA. You need evidence to support use among providers and patients. You need evidence for payer coverage, and to support standard of care. So, and all of these are critical to the business at different stages of the drug development cycle. And so here we just kind of laid out, what that really looks like across the drug development cycle. There's a lot going on, and it really should be done as a team, starting early on in the drug discovery process. The primary needs are understanding the disease target itself and patient populations. Sometimes this can be found in literature, but sometimes it requires new studies to be done, even early on. Then as you move through the process, clinical outcomes for your clinical trials are really important. The next critical steps, after you've worked through your clinical trials and FDA submission, is planning for commercialization, thinking about payer coverage and marketing. These might be studies like cost effectiveness analyses, understanding the prescriber landscape, and then revisiting some of those patient population studies that have been done to understand who are the users of your product. And just to sort of emphasize, as you can see here, we kind of put each the studies you need to be thinking about in the phase ahead before you should really be thinking about them. You always want to be planning ahead, not doing it reactively, but actually proactively. And then as you move through commercialization, market access continues to be important in the post-market phase, along with medical. So thinking about long-term efficacy and generalizability, and just overall. So there's, this was a surface level skim of the evidence to be thinking about. Lots of evidence for lots of different people, a lot of different teams managing this. And the problem is a lot of times this is done in silos, and communication along the way is really helpful to, minimize work and time and cost.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the best practices that we can highlight here. You really should be 18 months out when you're looking at a disease state awareness plan and an evidence generation strategy before your product is launched, figuring out where it's going to fit in the disease state currently and how you plan to get that information out to providers of all types.
100%.
For sure. So we talk a lot about an integrated evidence generation strategy. At one of our earlier slides, you saw sort of all the different places that or departments that evidence generation could live, right? HEOR, Clin Dev, folks in market access have evidence generation needs, right? And we talk a lot about sort of the idea of starting to come together in an integrated way to think about evidence, because obviously at the end of the day, it really is all the same across the life cycle of a product. And really the value here we're highlighting are the elimination of gaps, really being thoughtful from a what are the needs in the literature and what are the needs of the different stakeholders, really eliminating those gaps. Sometimes you can do that with data, sometimes you can't. But, as Allison and Meg and I like to talk, there's so much data now showing up every day, all day, everywhere, right?
Yeah. I read a new statistic I thought I'd share with you, or you can try to guess. So how many emails do you think are mailed every day worldwide?
I don't know. I'd say at least 10,000, maybe 100,000.
333.2 billion emails sent per day, as estimated by techjury.com. So that's one example of data that's generated daily. So, I mean, it's just mind blowing.
No, agreed. Multi-use of information, both in terms of data you can use to analyze, right? As well as all the places folks access data, right? All the potential misinformation that's out there, ways that things get misinterpreted. How can we be thoughtful in terms of making sure that people really understand the value of something, right? An evidence generation strategy that's integrated really does ultimately save you time and money, because you're able to be, okay, what study should be done sooner rather than later that you can, learn from and help contribute to the next study. And then ultimately provide a roadmap for the future in terms of what future studies, as funding comes in, as we learn more, what are the kinds of studies that we can do. In addition, something we haven't highlighted just yet is, the FDA more and more is really seeing the value of real world evidence, and not just clinical trials information, but how, what can we learn from data that are out there, right? Taking advantage of low hanging fruit or easier studies that could be done perhaps than just clinical trials, right? So.
Yeah, and really at the end of the day, having a solid evidence generation strategy is just going to let you be confident in knowing, what you're doing, the direction you're going, and where resources are being placed. Because, there's nothing like getting to the end of the study, getting to your next phase and being like, wow, I really wish we had thought to collect that piece of data. That would have been a really important outcome. And then having to do a completely new study quickly to get that data when you need it.
No, that's so valuable. We talk about in epidemiology, the infrastructure and time and effort it takes to do a study that enrolls 5 and 10 is the same as to enroll 500, right? If you think through it carefully and thoughtfully, there's a lot that can be done, from the jump properly. So I'll definitely have Allison speak to this, because this is definitely her world. But, medical affairs, we say, plays a unique role in this evidence generation process, and really is a valuable player and strategic partner in really being that air traffic control for evidence generation broadly, right? Medical affairs covers medical governance, right? It ends up having to be sort of the medical voice for a product, right? Within folks in medical affairs, Al, right? Study design expertise, data generation. Go ahead.
Yeah. So really, if you think about medical affairs and really what we do, it is important to make sure that we're doing a integrated evidence generation across all of the different functions internally, and really being the driver and almost the conductor, if you will, of what's happening when we come up with this evidence generation strategy. We really want to clearly, talk about, and I guess really articulate the value of our product, either clinically and economically, when it comes to who you're going to present this data to. So if you're talking to payers, for example, you might want to talk about the economic value of said product. Really being able to help physicians and patients together make the best decision for their care. So having and I'll use my example a little bit later on, but things change over time, right? So we have to be able to make these decisions in real time, even in the face of no evidence. So that's a problem. And we like to make, and since MDs produce or like to practice evidence-based medicine, we do need evidence to that end. And then, of course, providing the strategic direction for the organization is really part of our, I would say, the fourth competency of a medical affairs group.
100%. No, it was great. I learned so much working with Serono in terms of how valuable the role that you play in all of those conversations. And next slide, we're going to definitely take some time to, lean in a little bit on a specific case study that actually is specific to EMD Serono and the work that Allison does.
Yeah, fantastic. So I really wanted to talk about a case. This is our case study on evidence generation. So there is a product, one FDA product approved for HIV-associated wasting, and we really hadn't had any data generated about the product and actually about these patients over time. So a bit about HIV-associated wasting first. It was in 1987, the CDC said that this was an AIDS defining condition. And what that meant, it was actually HIV associated wasting was defined by involuntary weight loss, accompanied by chronic diarrhea, fever, and weakness for 30 days without an underlying etiology. Indeed, HIV associated wasting was a frequent, AIDS defining condition in the early days of the HIV epidemic. And today, HIV associated wasting is commonly defined as unintentional weight loss of body weight or lean body mass, as well as a reduction in physical endurance and overall function. So what happened was there was a study that was done by Tang et al., and it was observed for every 1% loss in weight, there's an 11% increase in the risk of death. So this isn't something that should be taken lightly. Additionally, weight loss was at least 10% from the baseline body weight, the relative risk of mortality increased nearly sixfold. So additionally, the multi-center AIDS cohort study showed that prior to the end of 2003, the median survival was markedly lower among HIV infected men with wasting than men that had no history of wasting. So we really needed to find out what was happening in essentially the last few years of the 2010s on through 2020. What's happening with these patients? So that's what we're going to focus on as our case study.
Yeah, no, that's great. HIV associated wasting, everyone knew about it in the very beginning, right? And then, like you said, Allison, with HIV meds getting better and stronger and more effective, folks, it really kind of went away. So we'll get into those details and why this evidence generation strategy was important around people didn't believe it really still existed kind of thing, So anyway, super, super important to be driven from. So you can really see in this slide where and how lots and lots of goals. This is just an example, right, of the kinds of things that would be valuable to understand about patients. SOC stands for standard of care, understanding patient engagement, sort of like what are the things that are going to get them involved with, physicians about a specific thing. Patient provider satisfaction, is this something that they see as valuable? All these kind of distinct and discrete sets of information that you'd like to gather. And how does that actually translate into studies, right, on the far right of the slide? Are there user research studies, prospective study that are observational in nature? Are there ways that you can use real world data or EMR studies to answer some of these questions, right? So you can see there's just a lot going on with lots and lots of potential choices that one could make in terms of getting to how to answer these questions.
Yeah, and I imagine tying it back to that case study, Allison, some of these things were things that you were thinking about as you're like, well, what is happening, right? Like we want to understand all of these questions.
Exactly right. So that's when we turn to an epidemiologist to help us. Actually, wasn't it funny that before 2020, did any of you know an epidemiologist? Now we all know.
Shocking, right? It is definitely kind of interesting that people now, I say that I'm an epidemiologist and no one says that I do skin or that, they actually know what I do now. It's kind of shocking. So, so in the world of all the different places that you can go and all the different kinds of work you could do, we like to take this sort of funnel approach in terms of developing an evidence generation strategy, really starting with understanding the landscape. That includes broadly, what does where's the state of the literature to date? What are the other things that folks have discovered since, the last time you thought or talked about this, right? Stakeholder priorities really speaks to, okay, in that slide where we showed lots and lots of different stakeholders, whose voice, how do you prioritize the different needs and concerns? If it's a new drug, there's a real need to show like, where is this valuable to payers perhaps, right? And really making sure that the needs of getting that drug to patients are aligned with, does it save money? And, sort of answering those questions. Not that any one stakeholder, need is not important. It's just prioritizing them in order as you start coming up with, okay, well, what's the study we should do first, second, third, fourth, like that. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, you really do need to sort of, frame it in the reality of what resources do you have available, time, money, right? If you have a ton of money, but it has to go fast, or you have a ton of time, but you don't have a lot of money, right? So you can imagine where and how that could impact the kinds of studies or the work that you can do, right?
Definitely.
Next slide.
Yeah, so back to our case study. So Grace, you might remember the brainstorming session that happened. We actually had a 2-day brainstorming session about what we thought were the unanswered questions, or why were we actually collecting this data in the first place? And what did we know? What didn't we know? What did we want to learn? How is it going to advance the field? How would it support needs for patients and patient access? What has actually happened in 2012 to 2019 or 2020? Like, is this actually a problem? Who will we going to share the information with? So we got a whole bunch of those stakeholders that were mentioned before in a room, literally with stickies, because it was before COVID, stickies, and whiteboards, and all of the data that we could possibly find, and actually came up with a very broad approach, listed all the questions. We had the big picture. We had the big picture thinkers, which are great. We had the people that were down in the details, and we really came up with a strategic plan of where we were going to go with our evidence generation strategy. Anything you want to share about that brainstorming session?
Yeah, what was so fun is it literally was to watch everyone kind of come together with all the different pieces of information. Like you said, you had folks, this is the study that needs to be done now, and here's what docs are telling me every day, all day. But then slowly but surely, as folks, we kind of got them aligned and on the same page, it really was kind of neat to see, both the commitment of everyone, right? At the end of the day, it really was, what's the information that would be most valuable to patients and providers to understand that HIV-associated wasting is still real. There's a biological basis for it. Here's where and how. Additional information to be able to explain to folks that this continues to be an issue that folks with HIV struggle with, right? Anyway, so it was a lot of fun, and just the value of providing that foundational, what does the scientific literature tell us, but then also the reality, like, hey, a real world data study is not going to answer all your problems or answer all the questions. There are limitations, right? There are some questions that we might need a couple of studies to answer all these questions.
Exactly right. So in step 2, when we summarized the scientific literature, there was basically one paper that stuck out, and it was one. It was done published in 2009 about HIV-associated wasting in 2005 to 2007. One of the brainchilds that came out of this brainstorming session, one of the great opportunities we saw, it was to contact the original author of the paper and to see if he would add to our discussion. So that kind of came a little bit later. But that did come out of the brainstorming session. The pros and cons of databases are interesting, but one of the most important steps, I think, is to really develop your null hypothesis, right? Without that null hypothesis, you're just data mining and you're not really solving for an unanswered question. So that was really something we wanted to avoid. We definitely wanted a null hypothesis. Pros and cons of those databases. We reviewed several databases. We leaned hard on our health economics and outcome research colleagues. One of the things that was really a problem was that there was no ICD-9 or 10 code for HIV-associated wasting. You would think that it would be there, but actually it was not available. So we had to look at proxy claims such as weight loss diagnosis, appetite stimulants, non-testosterone anabolic agents. We looked at enteral and parental nutrition. Of course, we removed anybody who had a cancer diagnosis, because that might be a confounder. And some databases we found had race included, others didn't. So we actually ended up with 2 databases that we used in this case. We used the IBM Market Scan Commercial and Medicare Supplement, as well as the Medicaid database.
That's awesome. All right. So let's hold on, because I do think that's on the next case study slide, because you're awesome. I love it. Okay, next slide. Oh my God, I love it. Allison was giving you already highlights for things to come, which is amazing, right? So
In my specific case, though.
oh, but it's perfect, right? Because,
Yeah.
our goal here was really to, be, sort of idealistic theoretical, but then also to weave in what this looks like in a real-time practical sense, right? So
Exactly.
as you can imagine, right, you get to here's a prioritized list of things you can do. There's lots and lots of different study designs that you can go into. There's, interviewing clinicians in terms of like, hey, do they think HIV associated wasting exists or not? Different partnership opportunities, where and how do strong partnerships with like big health centers, or, Allison, I think about the work you do in fertility, kind of flipping a little bit for a few minutes, just, with some of the large fertility centers and the work that we've supported you do at times because, of those very important partnerships, right?
Yeah.
Specific resource details, like you said, like, did Serono have access to specific databases or not, right? And then access to data, right? So I know you started bringing that up a bit, which was awesome. Next slide, you can hear, right? Like thinking about what are the important components and all the different things that go into what's the next best right thing to do, right?
Yeah, I kind of think of the strategy as being, okay, what are the questions we need to answer? And then how are we going to answer those questions, right? Is the next phase that we're talking about.
Oh, that's perfect. So, I'd be remiss as an epidemiologist to not go into the weeds a little bit, right? Because as Allison mentioned, you really do need to be foundationally strong in terms of what are the components of your actual study so that you're not kind of all over the place. I oftentimes will ask students when I've worked with them, it's like, okay, well, what's the question you're trying to answer? Well, what's the primary and secondary research question? Because that's so very valuable, because then everything can align from there in terms of, what outcomes are you asking about, what study populations are you making sure you're including, who's included, who's not included, right? What's your analytical and statistical approach, and how are you thinking about sort of handling issues that might come up in the analysis phase, right? And all of this tying into, making sure that you're basically answering the important questions that you're supposed to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly right. So I think that was one of what you just said, of the components of the specific study. Really, through the distillation of the brainstorming session, we actually came up with a list of 4 or 5 specific studies that we needed to conduct and look at.
Exactly.
I think just bringing it back to the unique role that medical affairs plays as well, a lot of times the skill sets within medical affairs teams also really lend themselves nicely to helping prioritize those research questions, coming up with the study designs, being the epidemiologist in the room, which is sort of why we're, proposing medical affairs can actually lead this.
100%.
So on with our case study. So we were able to get a commitment for funding. We were able to purchase the use of the data set. We did actually have a steering committee of experts. So those experts included internal and external stakeholders, but we had PhD scientists, MDs who treat patients. We had biostats and, yes, epidemiologists were there, all looking at the data. And then we had a statistical plan, and we built a model to analyze this rich data set. We had to get it validated, of course, by the experts for accuracy. And so here's the punchline. Our null hypothesis was that HIV-associated wasting does not exist in the era of modern antiretroviral therapy, of course. And we did not prove our null hypothesis because, in fact, HIV-associated wasting does exist in this world of ART, CART, ART therapy. In fact, what we found was the 6-year prevalence was determined to be about 18.3% for all patients living with HIV, 17.9% that were on ART, and 19.1% that were not on ART. Of course, this is a claims database, and what we know is that they filled their prescriptions for various ART medications, but as a con, we can't actually prove that they took them. However, this piece of data was actually quite surprising. And what that led to was, of course, additional analysis that was published in this paper in multiple abstracts. Because one important piece of this evidence generation strategy is to have a Congress strategy as well as several abstracts which get written in order, right? So the first one was about prevalence. And then they were presented at several meetings. And finally, we actually had this manuscript published in the AIDS Journal. And I'm very excited to report that the journal shared with us that the article was the most read piece in 2022, which is fantastic. So what does this mean? I just said basically out of 42,000 people living with HIV, we found that the annualized incentive of HIV was, annualized incidence. Oh my gosh, in front of an epidemiologist, I said that wrong.
You're all good.
Annualized incidence of HIV-associated wasting was about 3%. So if you think about it, 100 people walking in with HIV that walk into the doctor's office, maybe about 2 or 3 might benefit from an assessment to determine if they have HIV-associated wasting.
And the reason why that was so important is, HIV-associated wasting really has been around from the jump. And, this is now as much as an HIV researcher as an epidemiologist, right? Folks with HIV, because they age faster than your normal average person, I think wasting really does speak to other things that might be going on. Is it frailty? Is it pre-frailty? There's lots and lots of scientific, biological reasons why things are going on. So really honing in on, and interestingly, sorry, I think it's, again, the epi person in me needs to say, right, yes, it's only a claims database, but those are people who basically got ICD-9 codes that were associated with wasting. It doesn't even speak to the actual true prevalence of what wasting looked like, right? And so it was really, really valuable to say that, hey, there are clinicians that are seeing this to be a problem enough that we should be talking about wasting as a condition that impacts folks that have HIV, right? And then the only other thing that I want to add from the study protocol, very interesting, lots and lots of advantages, disadvantages to using the different data sets, as Allison put, but just one specific example, we didn't have access to lab data. So we didn't know CD4 counts or viral loads, but we did have access to, if the tests were requested. So that gave us a neat surrogate marker or a measure for, were folks in care? Did they get checked out, at least enough to get requested? So just some really neat, smart people in a room way of thinking about how best to do some really, really good science. So yeah, it was very exciting to be part of that effort for sure. And to hear that the AIDS paper was, most read, and not surprising, right? I mean, it really, I think, does surprise people that, hey, this is something that we need to continue to pay attention to.
Exactly. So that was the first question, like, does it exist? What's the prevalence? What's the annualized incidence? And then now our next question would be going into a database looking at de-identified electronic medical records and looking at patients and HIV prevalence there, specifically looking at attributes like things you can get from an EMR that you can't get from a claims database, which is, BMI's under 20, under 18, other diagnoses associated with HIV-associated wasting, such as weight loss, and really defining and assessing the burden of the disease and predictors of HIV-associated wasting. So in this particular data set, we've looked at hospitalizations and other interventions like ER visits, things like that. And this data has been presented in poster and oral presentation form, and the manuscript is ready and being submitted shortly. So very exciting that we've continued. You can see that it was part of the strategy, right? First, does it exist? How does it look? What's the burden? What does it mean to patients and providers going forward? So exactly right. As you said, Grace, there was a period of time where people didn't think that HIV-associated wasting existed because of the advent of the drugs that people are being treated with. And as you can see, it's not as prevalent as it was in 1987, but it still does have a place in the, it still does occur, and it still should be assessed in the modern patient.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you can hear, right, in terms of the way Allison in real time describes sort of the order of studies, the value of prioritizing it in that way, and how helpful sort of answering that prevalence question first in a way that now was able to contribute to the EMR study next, and then the other future work that they have planned. So no, that's super exciting. Okay, great. So we did want a slide that sort of brought it all together, or really kind of summarize it in an overview, sort of what does evidence generation strategy success look like? And Allison and I thought it might be fun to completely maybe sort of shift and focus a little bit on the work that, we've done, or I know Allison, career-wise has done lots and lots of work in fertility, and I've been able to support some of it, which has been great. But, just in another sort of construct, the value of understanding stakeholders, how you think to disseminate findings, and where and how does sort of like the strategic business alignment works as it relates to your the evidence generation that you're putting together, right?
Yeah. So in addition to an EMR database, which we've looked at, patients, average dosing, things like that for medication, one of the most interesting parts of the fertility journal. Oh, first, it's National Infertility Awareness Week this week. I don't know.
Oh, that's right.
The Empire State Building was lit up orange in honor of that day, of this week. So obviously, it's very exciting. It's top of mind for a lot of people. So one of the things about the fertility journey that's difficult is a lot of times people don't talk about their fertility journey, despite the fact that there's people on Instagram talking about their journey. In real life, I guess the kids call it IRL. People don't talk about it all the time. It's, it can be culturally, it can be, there can be a barrier, whether or not it's a topic that you even talk about with your family and friends. Other people are very open about it. So it's a very different kind of, you just don't know, where people are coming from when it comes to talking about their fertility journey. So there are very particular steps in this journey where people do drop out of treatment. One of them is after the first visit. They basically go through a kind of a initial visit with the clinician, doing a history, maybe a physical, and they set up their treatment path after they get a number of tests back, and they see that it's going to be this journey. It literally is a journey. Mm-hmm. So, for those of us who love biology, there's really only 13 times in a year that you can get pregnant. So if you think about that, once every 28 days, it's a very limited value. So if you aren't pregnant 1 month, you got to wait a whole nother month. So it really does stretch out as far as the time horizon is concerned. Anyway, we really wanted to find out where the people dropped out the most and what was the burden of the treatment path that led them to drop out. We wanted to also find out if they dropped out, they thought about dropping out and came back. If they actually did drop out and come back, and if they came back, why did they come back? So a lot of questions to answer. We had about 400 patients, a little bit less, de-identified, of course, answered the survey question. And where we've had a lot of data, obviously, found out a lot of findings, one of which was what was the burden that they cited, the reason they dropped out the most? Well, it's interesting that we allowed them to check two things, or more than one thing, and financial and psychological burden were very close, hand in hand. Mm-hmm. So where Grace came in was really her expertise when it came to qualitative data. We had some free text information that we really wanted to distill down into buckets and to see exactly what they were saying about that financial burden, about the psychological or treatment burden, and where those two things kind of fit, which came first, maybe. Just really looking at what patients said. It was a really fascinating peek into fertility patients' journey. They did cite that psychological, having friends to talk to, being their own advocate, having their spouse on board, having a support group was critical to reducing their psychological burden and just being able to talk about it. So I don't know if you want to share anything else about that, Grace, but
yeah, you can hear the value of different study designs, right? So quantitative data, right, in terms of the survey, qualitative data in terms of getting a little bit more in the weeds in terms of those open-ended questions being really, really rich in information around not just, okay, when we say financial, what does that mean? Is it not being able to, like, is that going to stop you? There was a neat question that was like, okay, if you didn't stop, what kept you going, right? Or if you did stop, what would you want to share with others, right? What would you tell your older self or your past self? So just, again, understanding that journey in a real sort of emotional pathway, because that really is what folks, were dealing with, was super valuable, and that social support that came up. And so I think just saying that, but even the study that you all planned in the landscape of all the other information that you've known to date, right? Not just the commitment to this patient population, but really where and how is the next thing, like what the support for a patient with with fertility issues really need, right? And so I think that in that broad understanding stakeholders was super valuable for sure.
Yeah, and it was helpful to our company too to make decisions on if they were going to provide, for example, a patient support program through the commercial team. Like, are they going to be able to talk to patients on the phone if needed to guide them on different options? So, that's it's interesting because that's a very good value add for the thing and able to talk to patients and to help them if they do tell them that they're having a psychological or some kind of, they're sad or they need some kind of turn to some kind of help. We have a laundry list of things on our website that are available for resources for those patients. So it's really it's good work.
Well, and I think that's where the disseminate findings could be really even as simple as, here's some resources that might be helpful, right? They can just, not just literally just because it's a long journey and there's a lot to consider, right? That I think is just really helpful.
Yeah.
And then ultimately the strategic business. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say that there is a study that was done by a clinical psychologist who specifically works with fertility patients. I don't think she'll mind if I mention her name, Ali Domar, who basically found that the stress of being a fertility patient was equal to the stress of having a cancer diagnosis. So very stressful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just know the cultural thing came up, that there are some cultures that, even get concerned about divorce or losing their spouse or domestic violence. I mean, there were a lot of things. There are a lot of sort of rich concerns of stress in addition to not being able to, sort of attached to not being able to have a baby as well. That came up for sure.
And that's where your expertise was really able to help us to guide us into the bucketing of that text and really pull it out. I know Meg did a lot of that work too, and to pull it out into something, statistically that we could look at, and really evaluate as a team. So
for sure. And that is the value. Yeah. The rigor that's required for qualitative data is definitely different because the data are, it's easy to think about qualitative data as more loosey-goosey, but because it's loosey-goosey in terms of form, you kind of get very, very strict about how you analyze it. So yeah, it was
you taught me a few things. Even though I did one of those studies for my PhD, I really did learn a lot. It was a different set of data, and it was really interesting to see how you did it. So
no, that was great. And then ultimately the strategic business alignment. I know that you and I have talked many times, even the work that you've done, we did in fertility technology and, just where and how research really to move science forward in alignment with the work that you do for your patients, I think was the neat thing that I felt. I learned so much from you in terms of just the value of, clinical research within a life sciences organization is so valuable from that perspective, I guess is what I want to say,
Yes, exactly right. So we had a witnessing tool and we wanted to show if it saved time. And actually that it did, which is great. And that witnessing tool was utilized in the laboratory. And we took, the normal strategic, normal procedures in the lab. And then the second group did the witnessing platform, and really just to compare like the time savings and the comfort level of having this tool in the lab. So again, another use of data that was published in Fertility and Sterility.
So exciting. Yeah. And that, like, literally just the foresight or the thought of, we interviewed embryologists and in an open-ended way to really get,
You did.
Yeah. What were the concerns? How does this impact the work you do? Like but just hearing, you can hear how, wow, that really is strategically aligned with all that you're up to. In terms of impact.
Exactly. And not even to our business, really to their business.
Yes.
The business they're in the laboratory, just being able to be efficient, to be able to be, just to make sure that everything goes smoothly is really important. And everyone had their role and everyone knows what they're doing. So, again, I leaned on my IVF experience to help create that survey. So it's very, along with my colleague in fertility as well, in our medical department. So it was really interesting and great. Some good findings that were aligned to both our business and their business.
Yeah, no, exactly right. We've taken you on a long journey in terms of evidence generation strategy, the value of all the different users, as well as where and how evidence generation lives in a life sciences company. We've focused a little bit on, what are the details and how do you kind of organize all the different places it can go, right? And then ultimately talked about, the fruits of your labor right at the end in terms of your publication plan, and sort of disseminate these findings, and where and how you need to be sort of thoughtful about what that looks like, in this new world of social media and publications and abstracts and things like that.
Exactly. Well, we're not going to wait for the answers to these polling questions, correct? Because I have a question for you, Grace.
Yeah, please.
While we're warming up to any other questions that come in through the chat. So we can't ignore the big question of, how is AI part of this story, and what is the role that it plays, and what's the future? And it's a lot of questions, but
it's a great question, actually. And it really is the right next question. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and asked, like, is this something we should be caring about or thinking about? The answer is yes. I do think that in the billions of emails that you talked about and all the places that there are data, I think AI will be a very valuable tool in terms of sifting through and really understanding what to do with all the information. I'm also a little bit on this side of older, perhaps, that I'm hesitant to think that it's going to answer all our questions. I think that AI is going to be a valuable tool as long as we're thoughtful and continue to use our human brains to make sure we're asking the right questions, that we're interpreting what AI is giving us in a way that, is aligned to what's the ultimate question and goal that we're trying to get to, as opposed to thinking the sort of anything's handled, if that makes sense, right? So I think ultimately AI over time is going to help us sift through lots and lots of information, but then there's going to still need that interpretation. How do you quantify? How do you qualify all of that into what actually will be most valuable to the patient, to, answering the next scientific question, is it helpful and valuable information ultimately, right? So I don't know if that is helpful, but
yeah, and I would say, I think exactly what you said, Grace, like sifting through and making the information that you need to make a decision much faster, much easier. But like at the end of the day, you're still going to have to come up with those questions that you need to answer, and also decide which ones are most important for the business at that particular time. And so again, maybe there's a decision like support tool where you're giving inputs, but like you're always going to have to be, thinking about those things.
Allison. Oh, actually, do we have questions coming in? I don't know, because the three of us can talk every day, all day.
I don't
And
see it.
one of the things I think that I wanted to touch on was, who is making up your medical department. So really, I think that before we would think about the medical science liaison or the medical director would be very, I would say, have very high technical skills, right? You would be very competent in your understanding of your technical expertise, your scientific expertise, data and things like that. But again, you're now in a customer facing role. So having some kind of, leadership ability, learning agility is important, of course. Customer engagement is like key to this role. And I think that that is really important. Maybe this is a whole nother webinar, I don't know, but having that strategic vision in medical affairs is important. And, marrying that strategic vision of that medical vision with your business acumen really could lead to a really effective medical affairs person. I think, I spent the first 20 years of my career in commercial roles in organizations, in pharmaceutical organizations, as well as selling candy, believe it or not, right out of college. But having that business acumen and understanding that along with the medical expertise and the understanding of the medical affairs role really can give you a complete picture of the business, and also the importance of having all of those strengths in when you go to hire or look for a medical affairs person.
I love it.
I had a question, Allison, too, thinking back about your alignment session. Because, we've been talking about medical affairs, but there's all those other teams, like you were mentioning, commercial, I imagine market access would have been interested in these findings. How were they involved in the process, and then the outcomes shared with them?
So very good question. We actually, in the steering committee group, we had everybody come back together and had a representative of HEOR, market access. We have a group in EMD Toronto called the Medical Outcome Science Liaison. So they're actually our medical personnel in front of the payers. So they definitely got that information. We talked about it internally. We did training on the published article. And then of course there's information that they can share externally as long as it's approved by our MLL process. So, I think that like you said, the alignment is so important, because you can do data for data's sake. This isn't that, right? This is data to drive insights, to generate the important data for patients and clinicians to make these decisions.
Yeah, so important. I don't know, Allison, you brought up, yes, it probably deserves its own webinar, sort of what it takes for a medical affairs leader to be successful. But I love that you brought it up, because it really is part of the reason why our sort of point of view, if you will, is that where evidence generation, sort of the hub or helm, who should be sort of like oversight, is medical affairs, is for all those reasons, right? It's kind of your worldview in a life sciences organization. It really is kind of what you bring to the party. You really do need to pay attention and kind of have alignment across, if I just think to just that medical, legal, regulatory review, how many times, the medical person's the one who has to go, where did this stuff come from? And is this really a study? And I don't know, you can't, and then folks getting frustrated when, if medical was included from the jump, or, was able to help, I don't know,
Consult.
consulted or included,
Exactly.
So the real value of that, I think, is so powerful, because, then it just gets stuck, and, sure, medical could be the sort of bad guy in that moment, but it's kind of like, but, you're looking out for the company and then some, right?
So I think that the medical, legal, regulatory review, we try to look at ourselves as a triad of a team. If one of us is not satisfied with the material, then all of us aren't. I think what's important is that, if you're going to create materials that go through your MLR review, it's important to do a concept review, right? And then to be able to make sure that that's going to actually be able, don't waste your time doing all the work if it's not going to get through. So concept reviews have been utilized a lot in our company, and I think it's a very successful tool and a great use of time. And then you can actually coordinate with your team members to find the proper data, the best resource, the best source to cite, etc. So just really use that tool very well recently.
That's awesome. Well, that's yet another way that, again, getting that alignment straight through is so valuable.
It's number one. That's why it's number one in the boxes, right? Number
Yes,
one. Get
exactly.
alignment.
Okay, well, it looked like there were no questions. We are available. Please feel free to reach out to us. This has been such a fun hour for us, for sure. And we look forward to interacting with you at some point after if you're interested. But thank you so much for your time. And Allison, thanks so much for joining us. This was a great conversation. Meg, as always, great. Any other last sort of parting thoughts? 12:58. We have a couple more minutes, maybe.
I think we left people with lots to think about.
I think we did too. Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.